Indeed, at the OECD, we have for many years been working on the issue of subsidies, and we have very much been doing this, I believe, in a spirit of saying you can't discipline what you can't measure. So knowing what you're talking about is a first step in order to be able to address whatever you would like to address. And we started already 30 years ago with our work on agricultural subsidies, but we are also working on fishery subsidies, fossil fuel subsidies, and very recently also on the use of subsidies in industrial goods. But I would like to start by picking up some of the points made by Bernard. And he made the point that we are talking here about, when it comes to subsidies, about a global issue, about an issue spanning multiple sectors, and I think I raised this already, and about a long-standing issue. And I think when you think about how many cases there have already been at the WTO, this is one of the issues you see. Subsidies and the agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures has been one of the most referred to agreements in the WTO in the WTO case history. Of the close to 600 cases at the WTO that were brought to the institution, around 1/5 dealt with the SCM agreement. Another around 1/5 makes reference to anti-dumping, which is very close. And you have to take into account that the agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures does not even deal with agricultural services. So this is only about what is not agriculture and services. So this is a long-standing issue, and an issue that has been haunting, let's say, the organization, because we have not had enough, as Bernard says, not enough evidence and not a good enough understanding of how to handle subsidies. But I will get back to that later. Some of the difficulties can be illustrated by the following anecdote. I was over 10 years ago working at the WTO. We were working on a report on the issue of subsidies, and we were looking at subsidies in the services sector, and notably at the transport sector. And unfortunately, one of the countries that popped out as a heavy subsidizer of transport was Switzerland, the host country. I can say this because it appeared like this in the report. And Switzerland was not happy about appearing as a heavy subsidizer, and they made that visible in a newspaper article. But why did Switzerland appear as a heavy subsidizer? That was because the country had privatized the transport sector. It was private, but received subsidies. In many other countries that appeared in the same table, transport was public or semi-public. And what the public money was that went into a public entity, we couldn't measure. So you would arrive at this contradictory finding that the country where the sector was opened most and privatized most would appear as the most interventionist country. And this, I think, shows to which extent it is difficult to assess, and we already knew that it is difficult to assess how to deal with public bodies, how to deal with state-owned entities. That was already an issue in services and is now potentially also an issue in industrial goods. So we knew it was difficult. We knew it was going to become a bigger and bigger problem with China entering the WTO. And here another anecdote. Around 15 years ago, a private sector consultancy approached me and said, Marion, we expect an explosion of cases between the United States and China. Wouldn't you want to set up a business in Geneva to deal with those cases at the WTO? So private sector already saw 15 years ago that the cases around subsidies would increase. And that was before the financial crisis and before COVID-19. And as Bernard said, these two incidents have led to more and more intervention by governments, and to somebody like Chad saying, you refer to this, Christian, that all governments are currently intervening in markets. Now, so a long-standing issue, an issue that the WTO has been struggling with, and an issue that will continue to be difficult to solve. Bernard made reference to some of the reasons. He said, in order to deal appropriately with the subsidies issue at the WTO, we will need to be able to distinguish between subsidies that help to pursue what in WTO language we call legitimate policy objectives, environment, public health, for instance, universal access, and subsidies that pursue more competitive objectives that would have a more distortive character in the market and that we would consider less in line with the WTO spirit. But making that distinction, to which extent is the design of a subsidy going towards meeting a legitimate policy objective or towards distorting markets, making that distinction is very difficult. And it's also something that has been haunting the system for a long time. Bernard made reference to the fact that the WTO rules are relatively old. One of the results of this is that the decision between what is legitimate and not is often being taken in disputes by the dispute settlement panel. And this is a difficult and very challenging issue. I can tell you by experience, when you are advising a case and you have to make a decision, a certain R&D subsidy, educational subsidy, environmentally subsidy is distortive or not, it is a difficult and scary exercise. And now it's very right that we do not have enough analysis and not enough guidance in order to make these distinctions. In my view, there is an additional difficulty. In the field of subsidies, you're very close to the field of finance. You are moving between trade and finance as an economist and also in terms of ministerial responsibilities. Setting different taxes for different companies or for different sectors is something that in many countries is considered to be something that falls under the responsibility of the finance ministry. It's not a trade issue. It's not a trade ministry issue, but it affects trade. So we're in the interface between the responsibilities of different ministries, and that's also where countries struggle with the decision what should be monitored or decided where, notably in which, and discussed where, in which, notably in which international institution. Let me finish by making reference to the work done at the OECD. We have indeed, as Bernard has already mentioned, been working for many years on the issue of increasing transparency and providing more data on the field of subsidies. I already said we started around 30 years ago to work on agricultural subsidies. We regularly publish data on over 50 countries, so that goes beyond the OECD membership. And you will see there that we report that there are hundreds of billions of dollars, around 600 every year spent on agriculture and subsidies. But this transparency indeed allows countries to compare what they are doing and to assess where changes may be necessary or useful. Fisheries, 33 countries in our database. From our latest data, we find that is around $10 to $13 billion a year spent on subsidies in that sector. Fossil fuels, we have data on 76 countries, and here again we are on a different level of magnitude, around $370 billion a year being spent on this sector. These are the sectors where we are able, with the help of national entities, to collect data on particular sectors. Where things become more complex, and Bernard referred to this already, is when you're looking at industry and the effect along a value chain. And we have in recent years started to put more effort on understanding how subsidies or aid works through a value chain from the upstream suppliers through the value chain to the downstream supplier in the final market. We have produced work on aluminium, we have produced work on semiconductors. And here, rather than working with data from public entities, we have to work with firm-level data, with information from firms on their financial statements that provide us information on how much funding or assistance or preferred credits have been received by the governments. And that's a lot of nitty-gritty work that is often value chain specific. So how aluminium value chain doesn't work like the semiconductor value chain. So that requires industry expertise and a lot of detailed work. What we find is that in aluminium, And we see a lot of activity by state-owned enterprises, but we also see a lot of the use of market credits that where the conditions are below market conditions. We see the same thing happening in semiconductors. In semiconductors, we see a lot of activity around R&D subsidies. It's the kind of subsidies where it's then difficult to assess what is legitimate and what is not. I leave it here, maybe again concluding that as OECD, we stand ready to continue to help members to measure what is going on in terms of subsidies, and we believe that this is a first step and an important step in the direction to understand how to discipline this kind of measures.